Rock and stone can be a lot of fun to draw. It can be really rewarding. However, it's often very difficult to know how to get started. So in this video, we're going to go over just a couple examples of how you might approach drawing rock and stone. In this first one, you can see I'm working with an outline. This outline is not perfect in that it's not a distinct line. It's got notches. It's got places where I haven't finished it. The reason I did that is to allow for the addition of texture later. I'm giving myself the out, as it were. I'm also immediately after I have my outline starting to think about where my light source is coming from. I've included my reference photo here so you can see kind of what I'm doing. It seems like the light source is predominantly coming above the object. However, it's maybe a little bit back behind. It's difficult to tell exactly, but you can tell by the angle of the cast shadow which it's leaning toward. After that initial step, I find it's really wise to start thinking about your darkest areas. In fact, if you only have enough time to do one thing when you're working with rock or stone, or really any three-dimensional object, it's best to start with your shadows and cast shadows. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm taking a peek at the actual physical object that I'm drawing, and I'm looking at where the cast shadows and shadows are, and I'm putting them there. The shadow, of course, simply represents where light cannot hit because of the rest of the object. The cast shadow is the shadow that is then thrown onto the surface below the object. Both are important. The cast shadow will often tell us about the angle of the light source and point out more specifically the direction that it comes from, whereas the shadows will just help us realize that the object is three-dimensional. You can tell that even at this stage, where really all that I have on there is the cast shadow and the shadow, that you can tell where light is coming from, that this is a three-dimensional object. Now, with rock and stone, especially rock and stone that is not smooth, there's often a lot of texture that has to be dealt with, and there's a lot of strange space in between our highlights, where the light strikes, and the shadow, where the light cannot. We call these the midtone, and I find this is generally the most difficult part of a stone to work with. So on this one, once I have the shadow done, I'm slowly starting to build up the areas that I see that are just a little bit darker than everything else. Starting with the bottom of that object and working up, I'm able to get those in place. And for this stone, that will about take care of me. Now, the other way that I could pursue this is I could actually, if I had a pencil or perhaps a ballpoint pen, I could very lightly shade in the entirety of that shape and allow only the brightest portions to stay as my highlights. Let's take a look at a second rock, one that's a little bit different in its structure. That first one was more pyramid-like, and this one is far more like a rectangle or a cube. First thing again, I'm going to work on the outline of the structure. You might notice that some of my proportions for these stones are not going to be perfect. The goal here is not to get a perfect representation of what we're looking at with the reference, it's to hone in on what's happening and how we can understand and repeat that. It's much easier on a large scale to work on copying something, to make a piece of art that is identical to the reference that you worked from. But that's just not altogether interesting. So as I'm looking at these, I'm not only trying to figure out how to articulate them, but I'm trying to figure out why. Why does this look like a rock or a stone? And that is going to give us the ability to build our own and hopefully to interpret other rock and stone formations when we look at them. So again, I am starting with the darkest areas. I'm building these up slowly. You can always go darker later, but it's really difficult to backtrack. Though things like white out, white gel pens, and white acrylic pens are often a really good solution to this if you have them laying around. Would be a really smart thing to just grab a couple if you've got a couple extra dollars, because they're a really advantageous tool and they can dismantle some of the would-be stress surrounding the situation. Rock and stone are good things to work on because, first of all, they're rather difficult, but they're also often just extrapolations of basic shapes that we see in our world. Most will be similar to a sphere or a cylinder, a cone or a rectangular box. Not all, but generally if you can break them down and think about them in those terms, things will become a little bit simpler. You can see I'm going about putting some additional hatching on this to indicate the darkness, building that up slowly. I'm happier with how this is coming about, though right now with only half of the object actually shaded, it looks a little bit intriguing. This will happen sometimes though. When you draw like this, you will often get a piece that is partially developed and in other portions is not developed at all. This is very different from working on a painting, which often tends to develop across the entirety of the canvas. This is something that as a drawer or a painter you have to deal with. I had a lot of trouble convincing painting students that your painting is going to look bad until it looks good, especially if they started as drawers and were accustomed to things slowly taking shape over the entirety of the piece. As you start to work on a portrait, for example, you can have the eye or the nose or the lips look really good before you ever go down to the neck or the ears. With painting, that is not often the case. Slowly, as I work across the shape of this object, I'm thinking about each of the gradations, trying to take a look as I shade in more, and now the contrast is better able to be understood. Do I need to add more here? Do I need to add more there? I'm leaving the top white for now. It is my highlight, and even though it's not white in the actual picture, I may choose to leave it white because that overemphasizes the direction the light source is coming from. On this one, obviously, the light source is either to the back and right, or more accurately, it's simply back behind the object. But not so behind the object that that face on the right is also in shadow. The light source is one of the most important things that you can analyze when you're working on a drawing of any kind, but especially one where you're trying to simulate three-dimensionality. As I'm working in the cast shadow here, we're getting that last little bit of direction of where the light's coming from. This rock looked pretty awkward as I began it, but it's turned out pretty well. It's in a spot right now where it's easily recognizable for what it is. So let's take a look at a third kind of stone. This next one is going to be quite different in that we're only seeing one side of it. However, this is something that you might run into, especially if you like to work with any kind of fantasy buildings or dungeons or even just architecture. You will run into stone that still has stone-based textures but is largely flat in how it's displayed to the viewer. Again, I'm starting out with an outline, giving myself the basic idea of where this object is. And I'm going to run into the fact that I'm going to have to expand it a little bit. This is perhaps a point for drawing with pencil first, instead of just jumping into pen. Sometimes it's more appealing to just work with a single medium. However, there is nothing wrong with using a pencil first to get your outlines in there. A sketch is often a very good tool to help you along. This one is quite different though. I'm tempted here at the beginning to actually go through and shade the entirety of it just a little bit, but I'm going to choose not to. If I did have some other pens, or if I had my brush pens, for example, and wanted to utilize them here, it wouldn't be a bad idea to shade in that entire surface, just to give it some color or some tone. And this is something I would advise if you are in a situation like this, where you have to draw a bunch of stones, or even just singular stones, that are mostly flat and sticking out against other surfaces. We as humans tend to recognize stones as being gray or gray-blue, and it's a really good way for you to take a shortcut and illustrate what it is that you're looking at. Alas, in this video, I am not going to be working with color at all. I'm working just with form. I am, however, deciding here to go ahead and give this one just a fine coat of shading. I hadn't intended to do this, but particularly in contrast to the prior one, I thought it might be a good idea to show what this looks like. Giving yourself just a quick pass of vertical lines in this case allows for the entirety of the object to appear just a little bit darker. As I did in the prior pieces, I'm trying to find my shadows. In this one, they're a little bit more subtle though, because of the way the stone is structured. Sure, there's that really dark spot on the bottom right, but that's not actually part of the stone. That's the hole that is actually extending back into whatever surface that is. So I'm choosing not to do that, though if this was actually going to be an illustration where I was going to draw the entire wall, those kinds of little dark spots would be a wonderful help in the contrast. In fact, even the dark part that I'm working on right now on that upper right portion is a little bit odd if you think about it as an isolated stone, because we can't see what it is that's above it that's casting that shadow. And indeed, we see that section on the right being darker because it's inset on the stone, and therefore the only portion of this rock that is actually getting the shadow from the thing above it. This is important when you're trying to learn how to work with rock and stone, how to work with three-dimensional objects in general, is thinking about all of the things around them. So if you were just going to copy this rock, that shadow would actually not make sense unless it has something above it. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to do here, because the overarching goal is just to understand how a rock or a stone works. And so illustrating it as it shows up is totally fine as long as you're doing enough analysis to understand the why. In fact, understanding the why is the biggest reason this kind of drawing is so rewarding, because as you think of each individual element, you're trying to understand why it looks the way it does. What trick of the light? What shape casting a shadow on another? What material it's made of? All of these things are incredibly important. For this final drawing, I'm going to do something quite a bit different. This is actually more of a cliff face. But I'm going to start in the same manner that I have before, thinking of each of the individual stones and working them out, and of course accidentally putting the drawing far too close to the other things, which will lead me to compress several of the shapes. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we're not going for photorealistic here. We're trying to understand the rock and stone. The first tip here is pretty obvious from watching what I'm doing. Break this big, complicated thing down into smaller shapes. If I try to process what I'm looking at, it's really, really complicated because there's so many little slivers of rock. But if you isolate them, even draw them as individual portions before you begin doing too much, it will make it a lot easier to understand. And again, this goes back to that separation of working from reference to just duplicate a thing or understanding it. It would be easy to grid this out, to take tiny little segments of it and just photorealistically copy it. But when you leave a drawing like that, you don't have anything beyond a final result. And I'm far more interested in understanding why, because I want to be able to draw rocks from my brain. I want to find things in my imagination and put them down on paper. And if that is you as well, I need to encourage you, when you sit down and draw from reference, which you should be doing, try to analyze what's happening. Why is that shadow there? Why is this midtone instead of shadow? Why is there a highlight? This will give you more insight into what's happening on that object. Now that I have the basic outlines in, I'm going to slowly start working on my shadows. I'm going to build them up slowly because, frankly, this kind of rock face and this kind of drawing is a little bit more intimidating, a little bit more difficult. So I'm going a little bit more slowly. I think you could say, honestly, I trust myself a little bit less. Working on individual stones that are standalone that cast their shadows on the ground is a far easier thing to do than something like this. But this kind of drawing is often more rewarding because it's more difficult. In fact, there's something to be said for drawing in general, that the more difficult things are often rewarding. You'll notice more use of cross-hatching here as well. That's to get a more subtle gradient or a tone that's in between something else. If you hatch too much from a singular direction, you'll often just make it black, and I don't really want that. I'm trying to get more subtle intonations here, echoing the actual and real gradation changes on the objects. Now, again, it's best to think of each of these as being their own thing, because they are. When you think about each of them as a shape, you can shade it accordingly. In fact, when you think about each of these cracks, the cracks are not dark. The crack is just a break between stone. It appears dark because no light can get into that little shallow crevice. Again, these little things are important to think about. Why does something look dark or why does something look light? Maybe I'm just echoing myself. I know I've said that a lot of times, but I'm hoping as I point out each of these examples that it will start to be something that you imbibe, something that you understand more instinctively as opposed to really having to think about it. When you first start drawing things like this, especially in ink, it can sometimes be a little taxing mentally because you're trying to think about so many different things. As you get better, as you practice more, you'll understand the nuances just a little bit more naturally, and it will become less stressful. If you find that your drawing is often stressful when you work from reference or when you try to do new things, that's understandable. You're not bad at art. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be capable of being an artist. It just means that you're human and you're struggling with a new thing. Art often gets written off as being fairly simple, or at least pretty two-dimensional. Pardon the pun. But it is not. It is very, very complicated. There are so many things and facets you have to process. For some people that maybe were born with a lot of artistic talent and have also honed those skills, they don't always know exactly what they're doing. They just know that it works. This happens. We see this in sports. We see this in musicians. But for most people, you're going to have to build those skills up slowly. You're going to have to work to understand the why behind each thing you're doing, each decision you're making. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how it is for me still, a lot of the time when I'm working on drawing something new. In fact, I will bounce back and forth from drawing new things like this that are maybe a little bit more difficult, that I'm actually going to learn from, and things that are just stressless. There's a reason I draw a lot of dragons and robots, because for me, most of the time, they're just relaxed. But whenever I draw things like this and go back to something like that, I'm better. When I draw my next dragon, my shading is going to be a little bit more subtle because I'm going to be a little bit more comfortable working with shapes and shading and gradation and texture that are not so simple. From here on, I'm pretty much just going to keep going as I am. I haven't sped up anything in this video. I've kept it exactly the same speed that I normally draw. For these kinds of lessons, I'm trying to keep that the case because I think it's only fair. I don't want to sit here and try to show you how to do something or work through a difficult topic and have you feel like you should be working at the same speed I am. I'm working pretty slowly here. I'm trying to be deliberate. I'm trying to contemplate what it is that I'm doing and learn. And I'm also thinking as I'm drawing this, what I could be giving as far as advice, as far as feedback and information to any of you who are watching and listening. I am doing a voice over this after the fact, though that's primarily because it's easier to get decent audio quality doing so. But I have thought about doing some of these live or even maybe some live streams while I work on things like this and talk about it. If you're interested in that, just let me know in the comments below. As always, these videos are here to serve you. They're not for my own benefit. They are to be a tool to help you progress. This is the kind of stuff that I used to do in the classroom years ago, though now, fortunately, I'm in a situation where I can do it for online audiences. So I hope that it's of benefit to you. As always, thanks for listening. I appreciate you being here, and I hope this video in general has been a useful tool. What would you like to see next? Is there another topic? You want me to just keep doing rock and stone forever? We could do crystals and metals and things like that. Or we could go into trees and flowers or animals. But I would love to hear what you would like to see in future videos. I go through every comment. I make sure I write down notes when those kind of things pop up. So this is not just for algorithm. No, it certainly doesn't hurt the algorithm. It is actual and real feedback that I'm looking for. If you're looking to join a little artistic community, we have a Discord server attached to this channel where you can work on things like this and share it with others, get some feedback, or even just be part of a little community who can help you along your artistic journey. There's a link to it in the description below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.